The night shift nurse hummed softly to the silent patient who never moved, never blinked, until the vampire king's red eyes opened and fixed on her throat. What she didn't know was that her voice had been the first sound to reach him in centuries of cursed sleep. Maya Chen pushed through the heavy doors of St. Catherine's isolation ward, the familiar weight of her stethoscope around her neck a comfort after another endless day of trying to sleep through the city's relentless noise. The antiseptic smell hit her nostrils like a sharp slap, but she breathed it in anyway, finding peace in the sterile predictability of machines and monitors that never lied, never gave false hope, never whispered promises they couldn't keep. 3 years ago, she had sat in a chair exactly like the ones scattered throughout this ward, holding her mother's cold hand while ventilators breathed for lungs that had forgotten how to fight, watching monitors flatline after months of stubborn, meaningless spikes. The memory flickered through her mind like a candle flame in wind, there and gone, leaving only the familiar ache in her chest and the certainty that she belonged here among the silent, the forgotten, the ones who couldn't speak for themselves. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, singing those ancient Celtic lullabies in a language that predated sorrow, and Maya found herself humming softly as she checked her assignment sheet for the night shift. Patient 127 occupied room 314, the same bed he had claimed for 6 months since arriving via emergency helicopter with no identification, no family, no past anyone could trace. The trauma team had worked miracles that first night, stopping bleeding that should have been fatal, setting bones that had been shattered beyond repair, stabilizing vitals that had no business staying stable given the extent of his injuries. But the real mystery wasn't how he survived, it was how he healed with a speed that made hardened doctors shake their heads and mutter about medical impossibilities. His tissue regenerated like time-lapse photography, bones knitted themselves back together with surgical precision, and his body temperature remained consistently lower than any living humans should be. Dr. Rebecca Torres, the head of neurology, had run every test imaginable, consulted with specialists across 3 continents, and still couldn't explain why patient 127's brain showed activity patterns unlike anything in medical literature. What truly baffled the entire medical team was that these unusual patterns spiked specifically during certain sounds, most notably when Maya hummed during her rounds. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The evening ritual had begun accidentally 6 months ago when Maya found herself working alone in the ward, surrounded by patients who couldn't respond, couldn't acknowledge her presence, couldn't tell her whether the pain medication was working or if they needed anything at all. She had started humming without thinking, the way her grandmother used to hum while braiding Maya's hair, soft Celtic melodies that seemed to carry comfort in their ancient rhythms. Patient 127's monitors had lit up like Christmas trees, his brain activity surging in patterns that Dr. Torres later described as almost musical in their complexity. From that night forward, Maya made sure to spend time beside his bed after completing her rounds, sharing the lullabies that had once soothed her own fears as a child. She told herself it was for medical research, that Dr. Torres needed the data, but in truth she found peace in the one-sided conversation, in the way his vitals seemed to respond to her voice even if his eyes remained closed. Tonight felt different from the moment Maya stepped into room 314, though she couldn't pinpoint exactly what had changed. The moonlight filtered through the Venetian blinds, casting silver bars across patient 127's unnaturally pale features, making his sharp cheekbones and strong jawline look like they had been carved from marble by some Renaissance master. His dark hair had grown longer during his stay, falling across his forehead in waves that seemed too perfect for someone who had been unconscious for half a year. Maya settled into the chair beside his bed, noting that his breathing seemed deeper tonight, his chest rising and falling with more deliberation than the shallow, automatic rhythm she had observed for months. The machines hummed their electronic lullabies, monitors displaying vital signs that remained steady but somehow more intense, as if his body was preparing for something. Dr. Torres appeared in the doorway like a shadow, her usually immaculate lab coat wrinkled from another 18-hour shift, her dark eyes holding the kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting medical mysteries that refuse to be solved. She leaned against the door frame, watching Maya arrange the blankets around patient 127 with the gentle precision that had made her one of the most requested nurses in the ICU, despite her relative youth. "Maya, I need to talk to you about your attachment to this case," Dr. Torres said, her voice carrying the weight of too many hopeless diagnoses delivered to too many desperate families. "I've seen nurses fall in love with their comatose patients before, especially the ones who seem to respond to their presence. But you're spending more time in this room than you do in your own apartment. Patient 127 may never wake up, and even if he does, there's no guarantee he'll be the person you imagine him to be based on his responses to your singing." Maya nodded without looking away from the patient's face, understanding Dr. Torres's concern, but unable to explain the pull she felt toward this particular case. The way her voice seemed to reach something deep inside him that medical science couldn't touch. After Dr. Torres left with a lingering look of concern, Maya began her nightly ritual, settling back into the chair and letting her voice find the familiar melody of Mo Gile Mir, the ancient song about a hero returning from battle. The Gaelic words flowed from her lips without conscious thought, learned phonetically from her grandmother's patient repetition, but carrying emotional weight that transcended language barriers. Tonight, the melody seemed to hang in the air longer than usual, as if the very atmosphere in the room had thickened, becoming more receptive to sound waves. Patient 127's monitors began their usual dance of increased activity, but the patterns were different this time, more complex, more purposeful, like a symphony building toward crescendo, rather than random electrical impulses. Maya noticed the change in his vitals first, the way his heart rate climbed not with distress, but with something that looked almost like anticipation. His breathing deepened until she could see his chest expanding fully with each inhalation, and for a moment she wondered if he might be entering a lighter stage of unconsciousness, perhaps finally beginning to wake after months of mystical sleep. She leaned forward in her chair, still humming but watching his face intently for any sign of movement, any twitch of muscle or flutter of eyelid that might indicate returning consciousness. The monitors continued their electronic symphony, painting light patterns across the darkened room, as Maya's voice wove between their mechanical rhythms. Then his eyes opened, and the world tilted sideways. They weren't the brown or blue or green of ordinary human eyes, but deep crimson orbs that seemed to contain centuries of knowledge and pain, ancient wisdom mixed with a hunger that made Maya's breath catch in her throat. The red was not the shallow red of irritation or injury, but something deeper, more fundamental, like garnets that had been polished by time itself until they could reflect both light and shadow with equal intensity. He blinked once, slowly, as if testing the mechanism of his eyelids, and then his gaze fixed on Maya's face with an intensity that made her feel simultaneously seen and hunted. "Maya," he whispered, and her name in his voice sounded like velvet dragged across steel, soft and dangerous in equal measure. The sound sent shivers down her spine because she had never told him her name, had never spoken it aloud in his presence, yet he said it with the familiarity of someone who had known her for years. "How do you know my name?" she managed to ask, her medical training warring with primal instincts that screamed at her to run from those red eyes, from the way he was sitting up in bed, as if 6 months of unconsciousness had been nothing more than an afternoon nap. The IV lines that had been feeding nutrients into his bloodstream snapped like spiderwebs as he moved, and Maya realized that the pale, seemingly fragile patient she had been caring for possessed strength that could break restraints designed for the most violent psychiatric cases. "I am Kieran Blackthorne," he said, his voice gaining strength with each word, "and your voice has been my salvation." Maya stared at him, trying to process the impossibility of his sudden wakefulness, The way he moved with fluid grace despite months of muscle atrophy that should have left him weak as a newborn. There was something predatory in the way he held himself, something that belonged to hunting cats and birds of prey rather than human beings. But when he looked at her, there was also something desperate, grateful, almost worshipful in his expression. The name Blackthorn meant nothing to her, but it carried weight when he spoke it, as if it should be written in history books or carved on monuments. Before Maya could ask any of the 1,000 questions crowding her mind, security alarms began wailing throughout the hospital, red lights flashing in the hallways as the emergency broadcast system crackled to life. Code Silver, isolation ward, multiple patients experiencing simultaneous medical emergencies, all hands to stations. Maya's training kicked in immediately, but when she tried to stand and respond to the call, Kieran's hand shot out and caught her wrist with gentle but implacable strength. "You must stay," he said urgently, his red eyes boring into hers with desperate intensity. "What's happening to the other patients is connected to my awakening, and you're the only one who can help me control it." Through the open door of room 314, Maya could see chaos erupting in the isolation ward as other long-term comatose patients began to convulse, their monitors screaming warnings as vital signs spiked beyond safe parameters. Dr. Torres's voice echoed down the hallway, barking orders to nurses and orderlies as they rushed from room to room, but Maya could hear the confusion and fear underlying her professional calm. Whatever was happening had never been covered in any medical textbook, never been prepared for in any emergency drill. Kieran's grip on her wrist tightened slightly, not enough to hurt, but enough to anchor her attention to his face, to the terrible urgency in those ancient red eyes. Maya's voice broke a curse that has contained not just me, but dozens of others like me for over 2 centuries, Kieran explained rapidly, his words tumbling over each other with desperate haste. A coven of witches cast a binding spell to stop what they called a vampire plague, but the magic required a pure voice to eventually break it, someone whose song could reach beyond the barriers between life and death. Your Celtic lullabies, the ones your grandmother taught you, they carry power in their original form, power that most people have forgotten, but that still exists in bloodlines like yours. The curse kept us in a state between sleep and death, conscious but unable to act, unable to feed, unable to do anything but listen and wait for the right voice to set us free. Dr. Torres burst through the doorway with 2 security guards, stopping short when she saw Kieran sitting upright in bed, his red eyes alert and focused, his hand still gently holding Maya's wrist. In 6 months of medical observation, she had never seen patient 127 so much as twitch, and now he was not only conscious, but speaking in complete sentences, moving with coordinated purpose, displaying cognitive function that suggested no brain damage whatsoever. "Rebecca?" Maya said quickly, trying to diffuse the tension she could see building in the security guard's postures. "He woke up when I was singing. He says his name is Kieran Blackthorn." Dr. Torres approached the bed cautiously, her medical curiosity overriding her caution as she studied Kieran's face, noting details that 6 months of examinations had somehow missed. When Dr. Torres moved to check Kieran's pupil response with her penlight, Maya caught sight of something that made her blood freeze in her veins. In the window glass behind Kieran's bed, she could see her own reflection clearly, could see Dr. Torres and the security guards, could see the room's equipment and furniture. But where Kieran sat upright in bed, there was nothing but empty space, as if he cast no reflection at all. The impossibility of it crashed over Maya like cold water, forcing her to confront the truth that her rational mind had been desperately trying to deny since those red eyes first opened. The hospital's public address system suddenly crackled to life with an emergency bulletin that made everyone in the room freeze. Reports are coming in from medical facilities across the country of similar awakening events. Patients who have been comatose for months or years suddenly regaining consciousness simultaneously. Authorities are investigating what appears to be connected to experimental audio therapy broadcasts that were transmitted to participating hospitals as part of a nationwide sleep disorder study. Maya felt the blood drain from her face as she realized the implications. Her voice, her nightly ritual of singing to patient 127, had been recorded as part of Dr. Torres's research into music therapy for comatose patients, and that recording had been shared with hospitals in 47 states as part of a clinical trial. Kieran's expression grew grim as he listened to the broadcast, his red eyes taking on a depth of sadness that seemed to span centuries. "You've awakened my children across the world," he said quietly, his voice heavy with regret and something that might have been fear. "They'll come for you now, Maya, because they'll need your voice to maintain their freedom, and some of them have been asleep so long they've forgotten what it means to be anything other than predators. The curse that bound us was created for good reason, to contain vampires who had abandoned the old laws, who saw humans as nothing more than food. Not all of us chose to sleep willingly, and not all of us will choose to remain civilized now that we're free." The digital clock on the nurse's station flashed 3:17 a.m. When the emergency call came through from General Hospital across town, the dispatcher's voice tight with barely controlled panic as she reported an incident in their trauma ward that defied medical explanation. A patient who had been comatose for 8 months following a car accident had suddenly awakened and attacked an orderly, displaying impossible strength and what witnesses described as fangs extending from his canine teeth. Maya felt her stomach drop as she listened to the report filtering through the hospital's communication system, knowing with terrible certainty that this was exactly what Kieran had warned her about, the first domino falling in a chain reaction that would spread across the globe. Dr. Torres grabbed Maya's arm, her face pale as she processed the implications of what they were hearing. The way this attack perfectly mirrored the awakening they had just witnessed in room 314, but without Kieran's restraint and centuries of self-control to temper the newly returned consciousness. Maya's mind reeled as the full scope of her inadvertent actions became clear through Kieran's urgent explanations and the increasing emergency reports flooding the hospital's communication channels. Her voice had been recorded 6 weeks ago as part of Dr. Torres's research into music therapy for comatose patients, a study that had seemed harmless enough when she agreed to participate, singing Celtic lullabies into a microphone while researchers monitored patient 127's brain activity patterns. That recording had been digitized, analyzed, and transmitted to 47 hospitals across the United States, and 12 more internationally, as part of a clinical trial investigating whether specific vocal frequencies could stimulate neural pathways in vegetative patients. Maya had signed the consent forms without reading them carefully, trusting Dr. Torres's assurance that her participation would help advance treatment for people trapped in their own bodies, unable to communicate their needs or acknowledge their loved one's presence. Kieran's history unfolded in fragments as chaos erupted around them, his red eyes growing distant as he shared memories that predated Maya's great-grandmother's birth. He had been born in 1798 to a family that served as guardians of ancient knowledge, protectors who maintained the delicate balance between human society and the supernatural entities that existed in its shadows. When vampire lords began breaking the old laws in the early 1800s, treating humans as livestock rather than partners in a carefully maintained ecosystem, Kieran had led a covenant of both human witches and reformed vampires to stop the slaughter. The image flashed through Maya's mind like a sepia photograph brought to life. Kieran in 1823, his dark hair longer then, wearing a long coat that billowed behind him as he moved through London's fog-shrouded streets with deadly purpose, a silver sword gleaming in his hand as he hunted creatures who had once been his own kind, but had chosen to become monsters. The Covenant's solution had been desperate and costly, a binding curse that would trap the rogue vampires in a state between life and death until someone with the right bloodline and vocal abilities could sing them free. Kieran had accepted the curse's price willingly, allowing himself to be bound alongside the monsters he hunted, because someone needed to ensure that when they eventually awakened, there would be a guardian present to control them. He had spent 2 centuries in that twilight state, conscious but unable to act, listening to the sounds of a world that changed beyond recognition while he remained frozen in time, waiting for a voice that carried the ancient power necessary to break magical bonds that had been woven with blood and sacrifice. Dr. Torres became an unexpected ally when one of the newly awakened patients in the cardiac wing broke free from his restraints and attacked a night shift orderly with inhuman ferocity. Maya watched through the security monitor feed as Kieran moved faster than human eyes could track, appearing in the cardiac ward within seconds of the attack beginning, his presence alone enough to make the rogue vampire freeze mid-strike. The interaction was unlike anything Maya had ever witnessed. A silent battle of wills that ended with the attacking vampire backing away from his victim and retreating to a corner of the room, his own red eyes fixed on Kieran with a mixture of recognition and submission. Kieran's control over the newly awakened was not absolute, he explained, as he returned to room 314, but functioned through blood bonds that connected all vampires to their maker, or, in this case, to the one who had sacrificed himself to guard them during their cursed sleep. The temporary nature of Kieran's influence became apparent when federal agents arrived at St. Catherine's Hospital within an hour of the first awakening reports, moving with the kind of coordinated efficiency that suggested they had been preparing for this exact scenario for years. Agent Sarah Cross led the team, her gray suit and professional demeanor doing little to hide the fact that she carried weapons designed for supernatural threats rather than ordinary criminals. Maya found herself in an interrogation room that had been hastily converted from a hospital conference space, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as Agent Cross laid out files containing photographs and documents that officially shouldn't exist. The United States government had known about vampires since 1952, Cross explained with clinical detachment, maintaining a classified department that monitored supernatural threats and worked to contain them before they could destabilize human society. The curse that had bound Kieran and his targets had been discovered by government researchers in 1987, Cross continued, and they had been using it as a containment method ever since, deliberately maintaining the magical prison rather than seeking to break it. Maya felt sick as she realized that her voice breaking the curse was not an accident of medical research, but the inevitable result of a government program designed to test whether the binding could be controlled rather than simply maintained. The recording of her Celtic lullabies had been analyzed not for their therapeutic properties, but for their potential to manipulate supernatural containment systems, and when the frequency analysis showed promising results, it had been broadcast to facilities worldwide as a field test of magical manipulation. Agent Cross offered Maya 2 choices with the matter-of-fact tone of someone presenting standard government relocation options. Enter witness protection with a new identity and spend the rest of her life under federal supervision, or assist Kieran in recapturing the awakened vampires before they could cause widespread panic and bloodshed. Maya's decision came without hesitation, driven by the crushing weight of guilt over what her voice had unleashed and her fundamental inability to abandon people who needed help, even if those people were technically no longer human. She had become a nurse to give voice to the voiceless, to care for those who couldn't advocate for themselves, and the newly awakened vampires were victims of circumstances they hadn't chosen, trapped between their human memories and supernatural hungers they might not understand. Kieran's own vulnerability became apparent as the night wore on and more awakening reports flooded in from hospitals across the country. He had not fed properly in over 2 centuries, sustaining himself during his cursed sleep through sheer force of will and the magical energy that maintained the binding spell. Now that the curse was broken, his supernatural strength was fading, his ability to control other vampires weakening with each hour that passed without nourishment. Maya could see the strain in the way he moved, the careful conservation of energy that suggested someone operating on reserves that were dangerously low. But when she asked about feeding, his expression became haunted with memories of choices he had made long ago. The conversation was interrupted by another emergency alert as three awakened vampires converged on St. Catherine's Hospital, their supernatural senses drawn to the scent of the voice that had freed them from their centuries-long prison. Maya could hear them moving through the hospital's ventilation system, their inhuman grace allowing them to navigate spaces that should have been impossible for creatures of their size. Kieran's response was immediate and decisive, ordering a full evacuation of the ward while positioning himself between Maya and the approaching threats, his movements taking on a fluid deadliness that belonged to apex predators rather than anything remotely human. The confrontation unfolded in the hospital's main corridor, like a dance choreographed by violence itself, Kieran moving with lethal grace as he intercepted each attacker before they could reach Maya or the evacuating medical staff. Maya watched in fascination and horror as he demonstrated the restraint that separated him from the creatures he fought, disabling rather than destroying, using precise strikes to incapacitate without delivering the killing blows that his supernatural strength could easily provide. When one of the attackers managed to rake claws across Kieran's shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh with equal ease, Maya found herself rushing to his side despite the danger, her medical training overriding her survival instincts as she pressed clean gauze against the wound to stop the bleeding. The moment Maya's hands touched Kieran's injured shoulder, something unexpected happened that changed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. The rigid tension in his muscles relaxed slightly, his red eyes losing some of their predatory intensity as her presence seemed to calm the bloodlust that Maya could see warring with his rational mind. The attacking vampires noticed the change immediately, their own aggressive postures shifting to something more cautious, more confused, as if Maya's touch had somehow altered Kieran's supernatural signature in ways they couldn't understand. Dr. Torres, who had been documenting the entire incident from the relative safety of the nurses' station, made rapid notes about the interaction, her scientific mind already formulating theories about the connection between Maya's voice and her apparent ability to influence vampire behavior through physical contact. In the aftermath of the confrontation, as federal agents secured the subdued attackers and Dr. Torres began running tests on audio samples of Maya's voice, the true scope of her abilities began to emerge through careful analysis and experimentation. Her vocal frequencies didn't just match ancient Celtic incantation patterns, Dr. Torres discovered, but created harmonic resonances that seemed to affect supernatural neurology in ways that human science was only beginning to understand. Maya's voice could break curses because it carried genetic markers from bloodlines that had helped create those curses in the first place, Kieran explained, his expression growing grave as he revealed the deeper truth about her heritage and the responsibilities it carried. Maya's ancestry traced back to the original coven that had created the vampire binding curse, witches who had sacrificed their own magical abilities to power a spell that would protect future generations from supernatural predators. The power had been dormant in her bloodline for 2 centuries, waiting for the right combination of circumstances to manifest. But now that it had awakened, Maya represented something unprecedented in the supernatural world, a human who could compel otherworldly creatures not through magic, but through voice alone. The implications were staggering, both for the immediate crisis and for the long-term balance between human and supernatural societies. News reports throughout the night painted an increasingly dire picture as vampire awakenings spread across the globe. Government agencies struggling to contain incidents that ranged from confused, newly awakened creatures to deliberate attacks by vampires who retained full memories of their pre-curse existence. Military units were being mobilized in 3 countries. Hospitals were implementing emergency lockdown procedures, and the general public was beginning to demand answers about incidents that official spokespeople kept describing as isolated medical anomalies. Maya felt the weight of global catastrophe pressing down on her shoulders, knowing that her voice had been the catalyst for events that could reshape human civilization. The personal stakes became devastatingly clear when Maya's phone rang with a call from her younger brother David, a second-year medical student at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. His voice shook with barely controlled panic as he described the chaos erupting in his hospital's ICU, where two long-term comatose patients had awakened simultaneously and begun displaying supernatural abilities that the medical staff was completely unprepared to handle. One of the newly awakened was a young woman who had been in a vegetative state since a skiing accident 3 years ago, and she had fixed her red eyes on David with an intensity that made him fear for his safety despite her apparently fragile condition. Kieran's promise to protect David came without hesitation, his voice carrying the weight of centuries-old oaths and unbreakable commitments as he swore to reach Boston before the newly awakened vampires could fully recover their strength and remember the hunting instincts that the curse had temporarily suppressed. In exchange, he asked Maya to trust him with knowledge that had been carefully guarded by supernatural communities for generations, ancient incantations that could be used to bind rather than simply awaken, songs that could calm bloodlust and restore the fragments of humanity that existed in even the most monstrous creatures. The first test of Maya's expanded abilities came when Agent Cross brought 3 captured vampires to a secure wing of the hospital for assessment and potential containment. Maya sang the binding incantation that Kieran had taught her phonetically, the ancient Gaelic words flowing from her lips with a power that made the air itself seem to thicken around the restrained creatures. The effect was immediate and profound, their aggressive struggles ceasing as their red eyes took on a clarity that suggested returning self-awareness rather than simple predatory hunger. But the effort of channeling that much supernatural energy through her human vocal cords left Maya drained in ways that went beyond physical exhaustion, her hands shaking and her vision blurring as she realized that using her newfound abilities came with costs that she was only beginning to understand. The drive to Blackthorn Manor took Maya and Kieran through winding country roads that seemed to lead backward through time itself, away from the modern chaos of hospitals and government agencies, and into landscapes that belonged to an older, more dangerous world where ancient secrets could hide behind crumbling stone walls and overgrown gardens. Kieran sat in the passenger seat of Dr. Boykin Torres's borrowed sedan, his red eyes scanning the darkness beyond the headlight beams with the alertness of a predator returning to familiar hunting grounds, while Maya tried to process everything she had learned about her heritage and the growing power of her voice that seemed to strengthen with each supernatural encounter. The manor appeared through the trees, like a Gothic fever dream, its blackened towers and elaborate stonework silhouetted against storm clouds that had gathered with unnatural speed, as if the very atmosphere responded to the return of its long-absent master. The interior of Blackthorn Manor told the story of centuries spent in supernatural warfare through artifacts and portraits that lined walls covered in dark wood paneling and faded tapestries depicting scenes that no human artist should have been able to imagine. Maya found herself walking through rooms filled with weapons that gleamed despite their age, silver swords and crossbows designed for creatures that conventional ammunition couldn't stop, while oil paintings showed generations of Blackthorn men and women who all shared Kieran's sharp features and piercing eyes, though theirs were painted in shades of blue and green rather than the supernatural crimson that marked his vampiric nature. Ancient books bound in leather and metal filled library shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, their titles written in languages that predated modern scholarship, while glass cases displayed relics that hummed with barely contained power when Maya walked past them. Kieran's explanation of his family history unfolded as they moved through the manor's shadowed halls, his voice carrying the weight of centuries-old guilt as he revealed the truth about his transformation and the brother whose ambitions had forced him to choose between family loyalty and humanity's survival. The Blackthorn family had served as guardians of supernatural law for over 500 years, maintaining the delicate balance that allowed vampires and humans to coexist without either species driving the other to extinction. But in 1820, Kieran's younger brother Damien had begun questioning whether that balance truly served vampire interests or simply maintained their subservience to mortal limitations. Damien's charisma and ancient bloodline had attracted followers among the vampire nobility, creatures who remembered the days when their kind ruled through fear and fed without restraint. And his vision of a world where humans served as livestock rather than partners had sparked the first supernatural civil war in recorded history. The memory of their final confrontation in 1823 played out like a nightmare scene superimposed over the manor's present-day shadows as Kieran led Maya to the great hall where ornate windows had been shattered by supernatural forces and never repaired. Maya could almost see the ghostly figures of the two brothers facing each other across a floor littered with the bodies of vampires who had chosen sides in a conflict that would reshape supernatural society forever. Kieran's silver sword gleaming as he stood between Damien and a group of human villagers who had sought sanctuary in the manor's supposedly protected walls. The curse that would bind both brothers in magical sleep had been Kieran's desperate final gambit, a spell that required him to sacrifice his own freedom to ensure that Damien's vampire plague could never spread beyond the handful of followers who had already been infected with his particular strain of supernatural corruption. Dr. Torres's voice crackled through Maya's phone with updates from the hospital networks that had been repurposed as supernatural monitoring stations, tracking the movements of newly awakened vampires through medical facility security systems and emergency response communications. The awakening pattern was accelerating rather than stabilizing, with each newly conscious vampire somehow triggering additional awakenings among nearby supernatural entities, creating a cascade effect that government containment protocols had never anticipated. Agent Cross's teams were stretched beyond their operational limits, responding to incidents that ranged from confused, newly turned creatures seeking help to organized attacks by vampires who had retained full memories of their pre-curse abilities and were now seeking revenge against the government agencies that had maintained their magical prison for decades. Maya's growing mastery of her supernatural abilities manifested in unexpected ways as she found herself able to communicate with newly turned vampires through what could only be described as vocal telepathy, her voice reaching across distances to touch minds that were struggling to reconcile human memories with inhuman hungers. 3 different newly awakened creatures contacted her through the psychic channels that her voice seemed to create, their mental voices carrying fragments of their former human selves mixed with the predatory instincts that vampirism had awakened within them. A pediatric nurse from Denver who had been in a coma following a car accident begged Maya to help her resist the bloodlust that made her want to hunt the children she had once protected, while a construction worker from Phoenix described the terrifying strength that allowed him to bend steel with his bare hands but left him unable to control his own movements around human beings. The conversation with these distant vampires revealed that their humanity wasn't completely lost despite their supernatural transformation, giving Maya hope that the crisis she had inadvertently triggered might be resolved without the mass extermination that government agencies seemed to be preparing for as their primary solution. Each newly awakened vampire retained core personality traits and emotional connections from their human lives, but they also struggled with supernatural senses that made ordinary human environments overwhelming and bloodlust that required constant conscious effort to control. Maya's voice seemed to provide an anchor point that helped them maintain their sense of self while learning to manage their new abilities, creating a support network that stretched across continents as more awakened vampires learned to contact her through the psychic channels her Celtic incantations had opened. The relative peace of Maya's supernatural counseling session was shattered when Damien Blackthorne arrived at the manor with a coterie of ancient vampires whose power made Kieran's abilities look pale by comparison, their approach announced by a sudden drop in temperature that left frost coating the manor's windows despite the mild autumn weather outside. Maya felt their presence before she saw them, a weight of supernatural authority that pressed against her consciousness like a physical force, making her voice tremble and her hands shake as Damien's influence began affecting her even from a distance. When he stepped through the manor's front door without bothering to open it, simply walking through solid wood as if it were morning mist, Maya understood why Kieran had been willing to accept centuries of magical imprisonment to prevent his brother's plans from reaching fruition. Damien Blackthorne possessed a terrible beauty that belonged to classical depictions of fallen angels, his features perfect in ways that human genetics couldn't achieve, his movements carrying the fluid grace of someone who had long ago transcended mortal limitations and learned to reshape reality through will alone. His red eyes held depths of knowledge and cruelty that made Kieran's ancient wisdom look like childhood innocence. And when he spoke Maya's name, his voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in her bones, making her want to step closer, despite every rational instinct screaming warnings about the predator who stood before her. The vampires who accompanied him were clearly from different historical periods, their clothing and mannerisms spanning centuries of supernatural existence. But they all deferred to Damien with the absolute submission of creatures who understood exactly how outclassed they were by his power. The confrontation between the brothers unfolded through dialogue that revealed layers of supernatural history and family betrayal that stretched back long before their conflict over vampire-human relations, their voices carrying the weight of shared memories and fundamental philosophical differences that had been simmering for centuries before finally erupting into open warfare. Damien spoke of their original covenant as a naive mistake that had prevented vampires from claiming their rightful place as the dominant species on Earth, while Kieran defended the laws that had protected both humans and vampires from the kind of supernatural arms race that would ultimately destroy both civilizations. Their argument revealed that vampirism itself was not inherently evil, but rather a supernatural condition that could be channeled toward protection or predation, depending on the moral choices made by individual vampires and the communities that shaped their development. Damien's interest in Maya went far beyond simple gratitude for her role in breaking the curse that had imprisoned him for 2 centuries. His red eyes studying her with the intensity of someone evaluating a particularly valuable acquisition that could serve multiple purposes in plans that stretched far into the future. He saw her awakening power as an opportunity to rewrite the fundamental laws that governed supernatural society, using her voice not just to free vampires from magical constraints, but to break down all barriers that prevented supernatural creatures from openly ruling human civilization. Maya found herself caught between the brothers' competing visions, understanding that both Kieran and Damien needed her cooperation to achieve their goals, but recognizing that her choice would determine whether supernatural revelation led to coexistence or conquest. The philosophical debate was interrupted when Damien's coterie of ancient vampires launched a coordinated attack on the manor itself, their supernatural abilities allowing them to move through walls and ceilings as they attempted to separate Maya from Kieran's protection and force her to demonstrate her voice's power under controlled conditions. Maya watched in horror as creatures that had once been human used speed and strength that defied physical laws to tear through the manor's defenses, their movements creating a deadly dance of supernatural violence that transformed the elegant halls into a battlefield where mortal rules of engagement meant nothing. Kieran's response was immediate, but clearly taxed by his refusal to feed properly, his movements lacking the fluid power that had characterized his earlier confrontations, forcing him to rely on tactical knowledge and centuries of combat experience to compensate for diminishing physical abilities. The choice of which brother to support was made for Maya when one of Damien's followers grabbed Dr. Torres from the communications equipment she had been using to coordinate with Agent Cross, the vampire's claws drawing blood from her throat as he prepared to drain her life force to demonstrate the futility of human resistance to supernatural authority. Maya's voice rose in a Celtic battle cry that her grandmother had sung during World War II when bombs fell on London, the ancient words carrying power that shattered every window in the manor simultaneously, while creating harmonic frequencies that disrupted the attacking vampire's supernatural coordination. The effect was devastating, but uncontrolled, glass shards becoming projectiles that wounded friend and foe alike, while the psychic backlash left Maya temporarily blind and disoriented. The destruction of the manor's windows served as a beacon that attracted the attention of Agent Cross's surveillance networks. Military units equipped with specialized anti-vampire weapons converging on the Blackthorn estate with the efficiency of forces that had been preparing for exactly this type of supernatural crisis. Maya realized with growing alarm that her voice was becoming stronger but harder to control with each use, the power flowing through her vocal cords creating effects that went far beyond her conscious intentions and seemed to draw on reservoirs of ancestral magic that she couldn't understand or direct. When Dr. Torres called her phone to report the approaching government forces, Maya accidentally compelled her to evacuate the hospital's entire supernatural research division, the unintended command traveling through the cellular network to affect Dr. Torres's actions without Maya even realizing she had issued a supernatural directive. Kieran's confession about his own struggles with bloodlust around Maya added another layer of complexity to their relationship. His admission that her voice made vampires more human, but also more vulnerable to their fundamental hungers, explaining why he had been maintaining careful physical distance despite their growing emotional connection. The supernatural frequencies that Maya's voice produced didn't just calm vampire aggression, but actually awakened dormant human emotions and memories that many vampires had spent centuries learning to suppress, creating internal conflicts between their predatory instincts and rediscovered capacity for empathy and moral reasoning. This revelation meant that Maya's presence was simultaneously healing and dangerous for supernatural creatures, offering them the possibility of reclaiming their humanity while also making them more susceptible to the guilt and emotional pain that their vampiric nature had previously allowed them to ignore. Damien's final offer came as government forces surrounded the manor, and Agent Cross's voice echoed through military loudspeakers, demanding the surrender of all supernatural entities for immediate containment and study, his proposition carrying the terrible logic of someone who understood exactly how desperate Maya's situation had become. Join him willingly, and he would use his influence to spare David and the other innocents caught in the growing vampire crisis, but continue to support Kieran's vision of supernatural human coexistence and watch as government forces eliminated every vampire, regardless of their moral choices or willingness to live peacefully alongside human society. Maya's internal struggle intensified as she realized that wanting to save everyone might be impossible, that some choices required accepting loss and sacrifice rather than seeking perfect solutions that preserved all the lives she cared about. The final betrayal came when Agent Cross's voice crackled through the manor's damaged communication system, with a message intended for her field teams, but accidentally broadcast through the emergency channels that Dr. Torres had been monitoring, revealing the government's true plan to eliminate all supernatural entities, including Kieran, while using Maya's voice as a weapon to hunt down any creatures that managed to escape their initial sweep operations. The escape from the burning manor became a desperate flight through woods that seemed to close in around them as military searchlights swept the darkness, Maya supporting Kieran, whose supernatural strength was failing, while Dr. Torres navigated using GPS coordinates that would take them toward Boston, where David waited in growing danger from newly awakened vampires who might target him simply because of his connection to the woman whose voice had freed them from their centuries-long prison. The city of Boston lay under martial law when Maya and Kieran finally reached the outskirts after their desperate flight from the burning Blackthorn Manor. Military checkpoints blocking major highways, while Apache helicopters circled the skyline like mechanical vultures searching for supernatural prey that moved too fast for conventional tracking methods. Smoke columns rose from multiple points throughout the metropolitan area, marking locations where newly awakened vampires had clashed with government forces or simply lost control of abilities they didn't understand, while emergency broadcasts warned civilians to remain indoors until further notice from authorities who clearly had no real plan for containing a crisis of this magnitude. Maya felt her heart sink as she realized that the chaos spreading through Boston was directly connected to her voice's global awakening of creatures that had been safely contained for over 2 centuries, each news report adding to the crushing weight of responsibility that made it difficult to breathe normally. Massachusetts General Hospital stood at the epicenter of the supernatural storm, its emergency departments overwhelmed with casualties from vampire attacks, while its psychiatric wards struggled to contain newly awakened creatures who retained enough human memory to seek medical help but lacked the self-control to interact safely with mortal staff members. Maya's hands shook as she read David's increasingly frantic text messages describing the deteriorating situation inside the hospital, where 2 long-term comatose patients had awakened simultaneously and begun displaying supernatural abilities that the medical staff was completely unprepared to manage. Her younger brother's final message, sent 3 hours earlier, consisted of only 4 words that made Maya's blood freeze in her veins. "I've been bitten. Help." The reunion with David took place in a storage room deep within the hospital's basement levels, away from the chaos above where government forces were attempting to establish some semblance of order, while supernatural entities moved through air vents and utility tunnels like predators, navigating their natural hunting grounds. Maya barely recognized her brother when she finally found him huddled behind stacks of medical supplies, his normally warm brown eyes now flecked with crimson that seemed to pulse in rhythm with his accelerated heartbeat, while his skin had taken on the pale, almost translucent quality that marked the early stages of vampiric transformation. David's condition represented Maya's worst nightmare made manifest. He was caught in the agonizing transition between human and vampire, experiencing all the physical changes of supernatural metamorphosis without gaining the mental clarity or power that would make his new existence bearable. Kieran's assessment of David's condition was delivered with the clinical detachment of someone who had witnessed countless transformations over the centuries. But Maya could see the concern in his increasingly pale features as he explained that incomplete vampiric conversion was often more painful than death itself. David's human immune system was fighting against the supernatural virus that had been introduced through the bite, creating an internal war that could last for days or weeks, while his body slowly succumbed to changes that his mind couldn't accept or understand. Without intervention, David would either complete the transformation and become a vampire with severe psychological damage, or his immune system would eventually win the battle and leave him permanently altered, but neither fully human nor supernatural. Dr. Torres's medical expertise became their only hope for stabilizing David's condition long enough to find a permanent solution. Her years of research into supernatural physiology finally proving invaluable in a real-world crisis that no medical textbook could have prepared her for. Working with equipment she had salvaged from St. Catherine's Hospital before their escape, Dr. Torres synthesized a temporary serum designed to slow the vampiric transformation process by introducing synthetic compounds that mimicked the magical energies present in the original binding curse. The treatment wouldn't cure David's condition, but it might buy them enough time to find Maya's voice could be used to reverse supernatural changes rather than simply triggering them. The true scope of Damien's ambitions became clear through intercepted government communications that Dr. Torres managed to access using the hospital's emergency network connections, revealing that the awakening of scattered vampires across the globe had been merely the first phase of a plan that stretched back centuries. Damien had been using the chaos created by Maya's voice to mask his real objective, awakening Morgana I, an ancient vampire queen who had been sleeping beneath Boston since before the city's founding, contained by magical barriers that required constant supernatural energy to maintain. The random vampire awakenings were providing that energy through their collective consciousness, each newly freed creature unknowingly contributing power to break the seals that kept Morgana imprisoned in crystalline chambers deep below the city's foundations. Maya's desperation grew with each attempt to use her voice for healing rather than awakening, her Celtic incantations seeming to create as many problems as they solved as supernatural forces beyond her understanding responded to frequencies that her human mind couldn't fully control. When she tried to sing David back to full humanity, her voice instead triggered a psychic cascade that awakened 3 more comatose patients in the hospital's neurological ward, while her attempt to calm a newly turned vampire in the emergency department accidentally compelled him to seek out other supernatural creatures and convince them to gather in the hospital's lower levels. Every use of her abilities seemed to amplify the crisis rather than resolving it, making Maya question whether her voice was truly meant for healing or if she had become an unwitting agent of supernatural chaos. David's plea for release from his agonizing half-state came during a moment of clarity when the serum temporarily reduced his transformation symptoms, his voice carrying the desperate rationality of someone who understood exactly what he was asking his sister to do. He begged Maya to stop fighting his conversion and instead help him complete the transformation into a vampire, arguing that existence as a supernatural creature would be preferable to the constant pain of being caught between 2 incompatible biological states. Maya's refusal to abandon hope for his full recovery created tension between them that echoed the philosophical conflicts she had witnessed between Kieran and Damien, forcing her to confront the possibility that some forms of salvation required accepting change rather than trying to restore what had been lost. The descent into Boston's underground tunnel system revealed layers of history that predated the city's colonial founding, ancient stone passages that had been carved by entities whose existence challenged conventional understanding of North American archaeology and supernatural evolution. Maya followed Kieran through corridors that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm, walls covered in symbols that her voice seemed to recognize, even though her conscious mind couldn't translate their meaning, while crystalline formations jutting from the ceiling created an otherworldly cathedral that served as a prison for something too dangerous to be allowed freedom. The air itself felt thick with contained power, as if the very atmosphere was struggling to maintain magical barriers that had been weakened by centuries of gradual erosion and the recent awakening events that had drained energy from their supernatural infrastructure. Morgana's prison chamber defied human architectural understanding, a vast spherical space carved from living rock and filled with crystals that pulsed with internal light, each formation connected to others through threads of energy that created a web of containment around a figure that floated in the chamber's center like a sleeping goddess. The ancient vampire queen possessed a terrible beauty that made Damien's supernatural perfection look crude by comparison, her features holding proportions that belonged to classical depictions of divine beings rather than mortal creatures, while her presence radiated power that made Maya's knees weak and her voice tremble, even though Morgana remained unconscious. The crystalline matrix surrounding her showed signs of recent stress fractures, hairline cracks that spoke of magical barriers beginning to fail under pressure from forces that had been building for decades. Morgana's history unfolded through Kieran's urgent explanations as they studied the weakening prison, revealing that she was not simply an ancient vampire, but the first of her kind, created through divine curse rather than viral transmission when she had betrayed a god's love in the early days of human civilization. Her transformation had been designed as eternal punishment for choosing power over devotion, but her supernatural abilities had grown far beyond what her divine creator had intended, making her capable of reshaping reality through will alone if she ever escaped the magical constraints that bound her. Morgana's awakening would not simply release another powerful vampire into the world, but would fundamentally alter the laws that governed supernatural existence, giving all vampires access to abilities that could make them gods among mortals. The revelation that Maya's ancestor had been responsible for binding Morgana's power, rather than simply containing random vampires, recontextualized everything Maya had learned about her heritage and the true purpose of her voice's supernatural abilities. The original Celtic witch who had created the vampire containment curse had actually been working to prevent Morgana's evolution, using blood magic and generational sacrifice to ensure that vampire abilities remained limited to physical enhancement rather than expanding into reality manipulation. Maya's bloodline carried the genetic markers necessary to maintain those binding spells, but it also contained the potential to rewrite supernatural law entirely if properly focused and directed. Kieran's confession about his true mission revealed the depth of sacrifice he had made in accepting vampiric transformation and centuries of magical imprisonment, his entire existence dedicated to serving as Morgana's guardian rather than pursuing his own desires or ambitions. He had not been hunting random rogue vampires in 1823, but had been preparing for the inevitable day when Morgana's prison would weaken enough to require direct intervention from someone with both supernatural abilities and unwavering moral commitment. The curse that bound him alongside Damien had been his choice, a conscious decision to ensure that when Morgana finally stirred from her forced slumber, there would be a guardian present who understood the stakes and possessed the knowledge necessary to prevent her escape. Maya's ultimate choice became clear as Morgana's crystalline prison continued to crack under the pressure of accumulated supernatural energy from the global vampire awakenings. Hairline fractures spreading through the magical matrix, while the ancient queen's consciousness began to stir for the first time in millennia. Maya could sing Morgana back into deeper sleep using incantations that would reinforce the weakening bindings, but such magic would require her to sacrifice her own humanity and become the eternal guardian of a prison that would need constant supernatural maintenance. The alternative was to allow Morgana to awaken fully and hope that her voice could somehow contain a being whose power predated human civilization and whose abilities operated on scales that mortal minds couldn't comprehend. Damien's arrival in the crystalline chamber revealed the final layer of his deception. His confession that he had never intended to serve Morgana as a loyal follower, but had instead planned to use Maya's voice to destroy the ancient queen and claim her accumulated power for himself. His strategy had been to manipulate Maya into breaking the prison's outer barriers, while he positioned himself to absorb Morgana's essence during the moment of vulnerability that would occur between her awakening and her full restoration of consciousness. Damien's betrayal of both his brother and the ancient queen demonstrated the depth of his ambition, his willingness to risk global supernatural catastrophe for the chance to become the most powerful vampire in existence. The three-way conflict that erupted in Morgana's prison chamber transcended ordinary combat, as reality itself seemed to bend around the competing supernatural forces, Kieran's centuries of discipline and training warring against Damien's raw ambition, while Morgana's stirring consciousness began to affect the physical laws that governed the crystalline space. Maya found herself at the center of a battle that would determine not just her own fate, but the future relationship between supernatural creatures and human civilization. Her voice serving as the focal point for energies that could either restore balance or destroy everything she had been trying to protect. David's unexpected arrival, his partial vampire transformation, allowing him to resist Morgana's mental influence while retaining enough humanity to understand the moral stakes involved, provided crucial support as the chamber filled with supernatural forces that threatened to tear apart the magical barriers containing them all. Maya's realization that her voice could rewrite supernatural law itself, rather than simply enforcing existing magical constraints, opened possibilities that went far beyond the binary choices of containment or destruction that had seemed to be her only options. Working with David to channel her abilities through his hybrid nature, Maya began to sing not the ancient incantations that Kieran had taught her, or the binding songs her ancestor had used to create Morgana's prison, but a completely new melody that offered supernatural creatures the fundamental choice between embracing their humanity or accepting eternal rest. Kieran's final sacrifice came as he drank Maya's blood, not to feed his vampiric hunger, but to temporarily restore his human nature, allowing him to wield ancient weapons against Morgana, while Maya's song gave even the ancient queen herself the option of choosing peaceful dissolution over continued existence as a prisoner of her own power. Morgana's defeat came not through violence or magical constraint, but through her own choice to embrace the release that centuries of imprisonment had made her desire more than continued dominion. Her essence dissolving into light that healed the fractures in reality while leaving Maya forever changed by channeling forces that no mortal voice was meant to contain. 3 weeks after Morgana's dissolution in the crystalline chambers beneath Boston, the city began its slow process of rebuilding, both its physical infrastructure and its understanding of a world where supernatural creatures were no longer hidden myths, but documented realities, requiring new forms of medical and legal accommodation. The vampire attacks that had terrorized populations across 47 countries ceased abruptly following the ancient queen's choice to embrace peaceful extinction, leaving government agencies scrambling to develop policies for the hundreds of newly awakened vampires who had retained their consciousness and sought integration rather than conflict with human society. Maya found herself at the center of these negotiations, her voice carrying a permanent supernatural resonance that made vampires instinctively respond to her presence with calm attention rather than predatory hunger. Though she discovered she could still sing normally when interacting with purely human audiences who remained unaware of the power that now flowed through her vocal cords like a constant, gentle current. Kieran's decision to remain vampire, rather than seeking full restoration to humanity, surprised many of the government officials who had expected him to desire a return to his original mortal state. But his choice reflected a deep understanding of the role he could serve as a bridge between supernatural and human communities. His centuries of experience with vampire psychology and supernatural law made him invaluable in helping newly turned creatures adapt to their enhanced abilities while maintaining ethical guidelines that protected both themselves and the humans they encountered in daily life. Kieran's dedication to helping the turned find peace manifested in counseling sessions that combined ancient wisdom with modern therapeutic techniques, his own transformation serving as proof that vampirism need not inevitably lead to predatory behavior if properly guided and supported through the difficult transition from human to supernatural existence. David's recovery exceeded every medical prediction that Dr. Torres had cautiously offered during his treatment. The serum she had developed not only halting his vampiric transformation, but actually reversing most of the supernatural changes, while leaving him with enhanced senses that proved invaluable in his new career as a supernatural medical researcher. His ability to detect supernatural physiology through smell and hearing, combined with his retained immunity to vampire mental influence, made him uniquely qualified to study the medical needs of creatures whose biology operated according to rules that conventional human medicine couldn't address. David's research focused on developing treatment protocols that could help supernatural beings maintain their health while living peacefully alongside human populations, his work bridging the gap between ancient supernatural knowledge and modern scientific methodology. Damien's survival of the confrontation in Morgana's chamber came at the cost of most of his supernatural abilities, Morgana's dissolution having severed his connection to the ancient power sources that had made him one of the most formidable vampires in existence. Faced with the choice between accepting a diminished existence as a relatively ordinary vampire or seeking the eternal sleep that Morgana herself had chosen, Damien ultimately decided that living without the godlike abilities he had possessed for centuries would be a fate worse than peaceful oblivion. His request for assisted supernatural suicide presented Maya with one of her most difficult ethical decisions, But her voice's ability to offer true choice rather than compulsion allowed her to help Damien find the release he sought while ensuring that his decision was entirely his own rather than the result of external pressure or manipulation. Agent Cross's offer of a position leading a new supernatural medical division reflected the government's recognition that the old methods of containment and secrecy were no longer viable in a world where supernatural creatures were actively seeking integration rather than hiding from human society. Maya's acceptance of the role came with conditions that reflected her understanding of the power dynamics involved. Supernatural beings would be treated as patients and citizens rather than potential threats, and any research conducted on supernatural physiology would require informed consent and would be directed toward improving quality of life rather than developing new methods of control or weaponization. The position allowed Maya to establish protocols that protected both supernatural creatures seeking help and human medical staff who were learning to work with patients whose needs went far beyond conventional healthcare. The New World Order that emerged from the global supernatural revelation required unprecedented cooperation between government agencies, medical institutions, and supernatural communities that had previously existed in complete isolation from mainstream human society. Vampires who chose to remain undead were required to register with local authorities and follow strict feeding laws that prohibited unauthorized consumption of human blood, with synthetic alternatives and willing donor programs providing ethical options for maintaining their supernatural physiology. The registration system was designed to provide support rather than surveillance, connecting newly turned vampires with counselors like Kieran and medical professionals like David, who could help them adapt to their enhanced abilities while maintaining their connections to human community and moral responsibility. 6 months later, Maya's specialized ward at the rebuilt St. Catherine's Hospital had become a model for supernatural healthcare that drew visitors from medical institutions around the world, seeking to understand how traditional medicine could be adapted to serve creatures whose biological needs defied conventional understanding. The ward's unique atmosphere reflected its unusual patient population, with modified lighting that accommodated vampire sensitivity to bright illumination and soundproofing that prevented supernatural hearing from being overwhelmed by the typical noise of hospital environments. Maya's daily rounds took her through rooms where former vampires learned to manage their enhanced strength and speed. Newly awakened werewolves worked with therapists to control their transformations, and witches sought help processing trauma from centuries of hiding their abilities from a world that had feared their power. Kieran's evolution into a supernatural counselor represented one of the most remarkable transformations to emerge from the global crisis, his learning to feed on emotional energy rather than blood, making him uniquely suited to help other vampires find ethical alternatives to traditional feeding patterns. His counseling sessions combined ancient vampire wisdom with modern psychological techniques, helping newly turned creatures understand that their supernatural hunger could be satisfied through positive emotional connections rather than predatory consumption of life force. Kieran's work demonstrated that vampirism need not be a curse that inevitably led to isolation and moral corruption, but could instead become an opportunity for deeper empathy and connection with both human and supernatural communities. Dr. Torres's research into supernatural physiology had revolutionized the medical field's understanding of how enhanced biology functioned and what kinds of interventions could help supernatural beings maintain optimal health while living integrated lives in human society. Her studies of vampire regeneration led to breakthrough treatments for human patients with degenerative diseases, while her work with werewolf transformation cycles provided insights into hormonal regulation that benefited both supernatural and human endocrinology. Dr. Torres's greatest achievement was developing transition therapies that help supernatural beings move safely between different states of existence, whether that meant helping vampires learn to tolerate sunlight exposure or assisting witches in managing the psychological stress of suppressing their magical abilities in predominantly human environments. Maya's expanded abilities continued to develop as she worked with an increasingly diverse population of supernatural beings, her voice proving capable of facilitating communication with creatures whose origins and natures differed dramatically from the vampires who had first responded to her Celtic lullabies. When werewolf packs began seeking help for members who had lost control of their transformation abilities, Maya discovered that her voice could help them reconnect with the human aspects of their dual nature, while witches who arrived at the ward suffering from magical trauma found that her presence could stabilize their connection to supernatural forces that had become chaotic or overwhelming. Each new type of supernatural patient taught Maya something different about the ways her voice could serve as a bridge between different forms of consciousness and existence. The relationship between Maya and Kieran deepened into a partnership that transcended conventional romantic categories. Their connection built on shared purpose and mutual trust that had been forged through supernatural crisis and strengthened by their daily work helping other creatures find peace with their transformed natures. Their bond was romantic in the sense that it involved deep emotional intimacy and physical attraction, but it was also something more complex that reflected their unique positions as bridges between human and supernatural worlds. Maya's humanity grounded Kieran's ancient perspective, while his supernatural knowledge helped her understand the full implications of the power that flowed through her voice, creating a relationship dynamic that served both their personal needs and their professional responsibilities to the communities they served. David's role as mediator between human medical establishment and supernatural needs proved invaluable as more hospitals began developing protocols for treating supernatural patients. His combination of medical training and supernatural sensitivity making him uniquely qualified to train other healthcare professionals in the complexities of enhanced physiology and non-human psychology. His research publications helped establish supernatural medicine as a legitimate medical specialty, while his advocacy work ensured that insurance companies and government health programs recognized supernatural beings as deserving the same quality of care provided to human patients. David's personal experience with partial vampiric transformation gave him credibility with supernatural communities who might otherwise be suspicious of human medical professionals, while his successful recovery demonstrated that supernatural changes need not be permanent or irreversible with proper treatment. Maya's nightly routine in the supernatural ward had evolved from her original practice of singing to comatose patients into a more complex ritual that helped various supernatural beings find peace with their dual natures and conflicting biological needs. Her evening rounds now included helping former vampires process the guilt associated with their past feeding habits, assisting werewolves in developing meditation techniques that could prevent unwanted transformations, and supporting witches who were learning to use their magical abilities for healing rather than the defensive purposes that had dominated their lives during centuries of persecution. Each patient presented unique challenges that required Maya to adapt her voice's supernatural properties to meet their specific psychological and physiological needs. The patient success stories that emerged from Maya's ward provided hope and practical models for supernatural integration that were studied and replicated by healthcare facilities around the world, demonstrating that supernatural creatures could not only coexist peacefully with human society, but could actually contribute unique perspectives and abilities that benefited both communities. A former vampire who had been turned during the Civil War era used his enhanced memory and first-hand historical knowledge to work as a museum consultant, while a werewolf pack leader became a wilderness guide whose supernatural senses helped search and rescue operations locate missing hikers with unprecedented success. Witches who had hidden their abilities for generations began working openly as alternative healers, their magical knowledge complementing conventional medical treatments in ways that improved outcomes for both human and supernatural patients. Kieran's growth into his role as a bridge between human and vampire communities reflected his deep understanding of both worlds and his commitment to helping newly turned vampires understand that their transformation could be an opportunity for service rather than an excuse for predatory behavior. His work with vampire registration programs helped ensure that newly turned creatures received proper support during their transition period, while his advocacy for synthetic blood research led to improved feeding alternatives that satisfied supernatural nutritional needs without requiring human donors. Kieran's success in enforcing the new covenant between supernatural and human communities demonstrated that centuries of conflict and fear could be replaced with cooperation and mutual benefit when both sides approached integration with good faith and realistic expectations. Maya's realization that her voice had never been about controlling others, but about helping them find their own choices, represented a fundamental shift in her understanding of her role and responsibilities, transforming her from someone who feared her supernatural abilities into someone who embraced them as tools for facilitating genuine healing and growth. Her work with supernatural patients had taught her that true healing required empowering individuals to make informed decisions about their own lives, rather than imposing external solutions that failed to address their unique needs and circumstances. This understanding guided her approach to new cases, ensuring that every patient who came to her ward received care that honored their autonomy, while providing the support they needed to make positive choices about their transformed existence. The arrival of a patient with wings and scales who spoke an ancient language that only Maya could understand signaled the beginning of new mysteries and challenges that would require her to continue expanding her abilities and knowledge, suggesting that the supernatural world contained depths and complexities that she had only begun to explore. The creature's presence in her ward represented both an opportunity to help another being in need and a reminder that her role as a bridge between worlds was far from complete, with new communities and types of consciousness still waiting to be discovered and integrated into the growing network of supernatural healthcare and support services. Maya's ability to communicate with this new patient demonstrated that her voice's power continued to evolve in response to the needs of the beings she encountered, adapting to facilitate understanding and healing across barriers of species, culture, and time. In the full circle moment that brought her story to a contemplative close, Maya found herself humming the same Celtic lullaby that had awakened Kieran from his centuries-long sleep. But the melody now carried hope and healing rather than the sorrow and desperation that had characterized her original night shift routine. The transformation in both the song's meaning and her own understanding of its power reflected the journey she had traveled from a lonely nurse caring for silent patients to a supernatural healthcare professional whose voice could touch minds and hearts across the boundaries that had traditionally separated different forms of consciousness and existence. As Maya and Kieran watched the sunrise through the ward windows, her human reflection casting clear in the glass, while his vampire nature remained invisible to mirrors. Both of them understood that they had found their true purpose in serving as guardians and guides for beings who were learning to navigate the complex boundary between human and supernatural existence, their different natures complementing each other in service to a larger vision of healing that encompassed all conscious creatures seeking peace and understanding in a world that was finally large enough to contain them all. 1 year after the establishment of her supernatural medical ward, Maya's innovative approach to interspecies healthcare had gained international recognition from both human medical institutions and supernatural communities worldwide, drawing delegations of healthcare professionals, government officials, and supernatural representatives who sought to understand and replicate her methods for facilitating healing across the boundaries of species and consciousness. The ward had expanded from a single hospital floor to an entire medical complex that served as a training center for the new field of supernatural medicine. While Maya's voice had become legendary among creatures who had never before experienced the possibility of being truly heard and understood by someone who could bridge the gap between their unique forms of consciousness and the broader world they inhabited. Her daily routine now included consulting with medical facilities on 6 continents, coordinating with international supernatural affairs agencies, and continuing her direct patient care work that remained the foundation of everything she had built. The patient with wings and scales who had arrived speaking an ancient language finally revealed her identity as Seraphina, one of the last celestial beings who had maintained contact with earthbound reality, while her fellow angels had retreated into silence that threatened to disrupt the cosmic harmony that had maintained balance between different realms of consciousness for millennia. Seraphina's luminous presence in the ward attracted other celestial beings who had been searching for someone capable of facilitating communication with their silent brethren, while her own healing from centuries of isolation and trauma demonstrated that even divine creatures required the same compassion and understanding that Maya had learned to provide for vampires, werewolves, and other supernatural patients. The revelation that vampires had been merely the beginning of a much larger supernatural population expanded Maya's understanding of her role from helping individual creatures to potentially serving as a mediator for conflicts that spanned multiple dimensions of reality. Kieran's evolution into something unprecedented in vampire history reflected the transformative power of sustained emotional connection and ethical commitment, his supernatural nature stabilizing into a form that no longer required blood for sustenance and could tolerate daylight exposure without pain or weakness. His ability to exist comfortably in both human and supernatural environments, while retaining his centuries of accumulated wisdom, made him invaluable as Maya's partner in increasingly complex diplomatic missions that required both supernatural strength and deep understanding of the historical conflicts between different species. Kieran's transformation demonstrated that vampire nature was not fixed or immutable, but could evolve in response to love, purpose, and sustained commitment to serving something greater than individual hunger or desire. Maya's mastery of her voice's supernatural properties had expanded beyond her original ability to awaken and calm vampires, developing into a complex form of consciousness that could facilitate communication between any species, regardless of their biological or metaphysical differences. Her voice had become a universal translator that worked not by converting words between languages, but by enabling direct mind-to-mind contact that bypassed the limitations of species-specific communication methods and allowed genuine understanding to occur between beings whose thought processes operated according to completely different principles. This ability made Maya invaluable to supernatural diplomacy efforts that sought to prevent conflicts between species who had misunderstood each other's intentions for centuries due to their inability to communicate effectively across the barriers of biology and culture. Dr. Torres's breakthrough research into supernatural physiology had culminated in the development of medical technologies that could safely interact with enhanced biology without causing harmful interference or adverse reactions, allowing supernatural beings to receive advanced medical care without fear that human technology would disrupt their unique physiological processes. Her innovations included modified diagnostic equipment that could detect supernatural energy patterns, surgical tools that could operate on enhanced healing systems without triggering unwanted regeneration responses, and pharmaceutical compounds that worked synergistically with supernatural metabolism rather than being rejected by enhanced immune systems. Dr. Torres's work had transformed supernatural medicine from an experimental field into a established medical specialty with standardized protocols and training programs that were being implemented in hospitals around the world. The celestial crisis that emerged through Seraphina's revelations threatened to destabilize global weather patterns and natural cycles as silent angels withdrew their influence from earthbound systems that had depended on celestial guidance for millennia, creating climatic chaos that human science could not explain or predict through conventional meteorological models. The angels' silence was not a voluntary retreat, but a traumatic response to centuries of human warfare, environmental destruction, and spiritual disconnection that had made their traditional role as guardians of natural harmony increasingly difficult to maintain. Maya's mission to re-establish communication with celestial choirs required her to travel to sacred sites worldwide where the original contracts between heaven and earth had been established, using her voice to reach across dimensional barriers and convince traumatized angels that humanity was ready to participate in cosmic harmony rather than perpetually disrupting it. Kieran's partnership in Maya's celestial diplomacy missions proved essential as his immortal perspective and supernatural abilities provided protection during journeys to sacred locations that were often guarded by ancient forces hostile to unauthorized intrusion. While his deep understanding of supernatural psychology helped him recognize when celestial beings were responding to Maya's voice with healing rather than continued withdrawal. His presence served as proof that supernatural transformation could lead to wisdom and service rather than predation and destruction, demonstrating to suspicious angels that earthbound creatures were capable of evolving beyond their original nature when motivated by love and commitment to universal harmony. Kieran's own transformation from predator to protector provided a model for the kind of consciousness evolution that celestial beings hope to see in all earthbound species. David's development into a supernatural physician with enhanced abilities that combined his human medical training with supernatural sensitivity to non-human physiology made him invaluable in coordinating global medical responses to celestial interference effects that manifested as unexplained illnesses and physiological disruptions in both human and supernatural populations. His work involved establishing protocols for treating patients whose symptoms resulted from cosmic imbalance rather than conventional disease processes, while his research into the medical implications of interdimensional contact helped prepare healthcare systems for the broader supernatural revelation that would inevitably occur as Maya's work brought hidden species into contact with mainstream human society. David's unique position as someone who had survived supernatural transformation while retaining his human identity made him an ideal ambassador between purely human medical professionals and the supernatural healing practitioners who were beginning to work openly in integrated healthcare environments. Agent Cross's revelation of demonic influences attempting to exploit celestial silence for political manipulation added urgent complexity to Maya's mission, as demons sought to fill the power vacuum created by withdrawn angels through subtle psychological influence over world leaders and decision-makers who remained unaware of the supernatural forces affecting their judgment. The demon's strategy involved amplifying existing human tendencies toward conflict and environmental destruction rather than introducing obviously supernatural elements, making their influence difficult to detect through conventional intelligence methods while maximizing the chaos that would result from humanity's unconscious participation in cosmic imbalance. Maya's ability to detect and counter demonic influence through her voice became crucial for protecting key political figures and maintaining global stability while she worked to restore celestial communication. Maya's growing awareness that each use of her expanding abilities made her less human and more something unprecedented forced her to confront the possibility that saving the world from cosmic imbalance might require sacrificing her own mortality and connection to the human experience that had originally motivated her healing work. Her voice's evolution into something beyond human vocal capacity reflected a fundamental change in her consciousness that was drawing her away from earthbound existence toward a form of awareness that could encompass multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously. The choice between maintaining her humanity and fulfilling her cosmic role created intense personal conflict, as Maya struggled to understand whether her essential self could survive the transformation that seemed necessary for completing her mission to restore universal harmony. The climactic confrontation at Mount Sinai, where humanity's original contract with celestial forces had been established millennia ago, provided the setting for revelations that recontextualized Maya's entire existence and her relationship with forces that had been guiding her development since childhood. The sacred mountain's atmosphere resonated with her voice in ways that suggested her connection to cosmic harmony was not a recent development, but a restoration of abilities that had been dormant for lifetimes, while ancient symbols carved into the mountain's stone surfaces seemed to respond to her presence with light and energy that had been absent for centuries. The location's significance as a meeting point between earthbound and celestial consciousness made it the ideal setting for attempting to bridge the gap between traumatized angels and the human world they had abandoned. The ultimate revelation that Maya was the reincarnation of the original voice that had established harmony between all conscious species at the dawn of civilization explained both her unprecedented abilities and the cosmic significance of her seemingly simple desire to help suffering beings find peace and understanding. Her soul had been cycling through lifetimes of preparation for the moment when cosmic harmony would need to be restored through someone who could understand and communicate with all forms of consciousness while maintaining the compassion and humility that only earthbound existence could provide. This understanding transformed Maya's perception of her role from individual healer to cosmic force, while also explaining why her voice had always seemed to recognize ancient languages and supernatural frequencies that her human mind had never learned. Kiran's true nature as Maya's eternal guardian across multiple lifetimes revealed the depth of his sacrifice in choosing vampire immortality as a means of surviving long enough to find and protect her during her current incarnation, his consciousness having maintained its essential identity through centuries of supernatural existence, motivated entirely by love and commitment to their shared purpose. His recognition of Maya's true nature had occurred gradually as her abilities developed, but his understanding of their eternal connection explained his immediate attraction to her voice and his willingness to abandon his previous existence for the opportunity to serve her mission. Kiran's revelation that he had been searching for her across centuries of lonely existence added profound meaning to their partnership, while demonstrating that true love could transcend the boundaries of species, mortality, and time itself. Maya's ultimate choice between becoming a celestial being and retaining her humanity was transformed by Seraphina's offer of a third option that would allow her to become an eternal mediator between realms without losing the essential qualities that made her effective as a healer and communicator. This new form of existence would preserve her compassion, humility, and understanding of mortal suffering while granting her the cosmic awareness and multidimensional presence necessary for maintaining universal harmony across all conscious species and realms. Maya's decision to embrace this unprecedented transformation reflected her understanding that true service sometimes required accepting change that felt like loss, but ultimately created opportunities for greater healing and connection than would have been possible within the limitations of purely human existence. Kiran's evolution in response to Maya's transformation demonstrated that love could be a force for consciousness development that transcended the boundaries of individual identity, his vampire nature dissolving into something equally unprecedented as their eternal partnership required both participants to become capable of existing across multiple dimensions while maintaining their essential connection to each other and their shared purpose. His transformation into Maya's eternal partner required releasing his attachment to vampire identity while preserving the wisdom and strength that immortal existence had provided, creating a new form of consciousness that could serve as both guardian and collaborator in Maya's cosmic mediation work. Their relationship evolved beyond traditional romance into a partnership that encompassed shared consciousness, mutual purpose, and eternal commitment to serving universal harmony. The resolution of Maya's transformation into a cosmic mediator created immediate effects that rippled across all conscious species and dimensions, establishing communication channels that had been severed for millennia and enabling unprecedented cooperation between beings who had previously existed in isolation or conflict due to their inability to understand each other's perspectives and needs. Maya's new form of consciousness could simultaneously exist in multiple realms while maintaining awareness of the connections between all conscious beings, allowing her to facilitate healing and understanding on scales that no earthbound healer could achieve while preserving the intimate, personal approach that had made her original nursing work so effective. Her transformation represented not a loss of humanity, but an expansion of human potential that demonstrated the species' capacity for evolution beyond purely biological limitations when motivated by love and service to universal well-being. The ward's transformation into a global center for interspecies healing and understanding reflected the broader changes that Maya's work had initiated throughout human and supernatural society, establishing protocols and training programs that allowed healthcare professionals from all conscious species to collaborate in providing comprehensive care that addressed both individual needs and broader cosmic harmony. David's leadership of a new generation of physicians trained to treat any conscious being ensured that Maya's innovations would continue developing long after her transformation, while Dr. Yi Torres's research had permanently bridged supernatural and human medicine in ways that benefited all species. Agent Cross's evolution from supernatural control to supernatural cooperation reflected humanity's broader shift from fear-based responses to integration-based approaches that recognize the mutual benefits of interspecies collaboration and understanding. Maya's final song, as she completed her transformation into cosmic mediator, span all languages and species while carrying the essence of the Celtic lullaby that had begun her journey, ensuring that no conscious being would ever again suffer alone in silence without the possibility of being heard and understood by someone capable of facilitating healing and connection. Her voice now reached across dimensions to offer comfort and hope to any being experiencing isolation, trauma, or confusion about their place in the cosmic order, while her presence as eternal mediator guaranteed that conflicts between species could be resolved through communication and understanding rather than violence and fear. The story's conclusion with Maya still singing at night, but now across multiple dimensions simultaneously, provided perfect closure for her journey from lonely nurse to cosmic healer, while maintaining the intimate personal quality that had always characterized her approach to helping others find peace and understanding in their transformed existence.